Now, this is a real weird headline to read. Dark and Darker lawyers ask Valve to bring the game back to Steam in letter blasting Nexon for, quote, anti-competitive bully tactics. Nexon's claim relates to a game that Nexon never made and which does not exist. Now, this is very strange because I don't know, as a lawyer, why specifically you'd be asking Valve to bring back the game, because Valve's hands are sort of tied on this one. Valve is a complete, irrelevant party within this equation, because typically, obviously, I'll explain what their perspective is, I guess. Dark and Darker wants to be on Steam so that they can distribute the game to people and people can play. What's in it for Steam? What's in it for Valve? Well, of course, if the game gets sold, Valve takes their cut and they get their money. So it's in Valve's best interest to have games that people want to play on the platform. So those two parties have, of course, a vested interest in the game coming out. So why would Valve not allow the game back on Steam if they could? Well, because that's obviously not how DMCAs work. As an independent third party that hosts other people's content, like YouTube, like Twitter, like Facebook, like Steam, like pretty much anything else, the reason companies can't take you to court for hosting copyright infringing material, because you're making it available to people, is that you have something called safe harbor, which just means that you comply to the DMCAs. If you don't comply with what look like valid DMCAs, then you are then putting your safe harbor status at risk, and you can be sued for hosting allegedly infringed material. So I've explained this a bunch of times, but it seems to be lost on some people, so I'll explain it again. At least from a layman's perspective, and somebody who does YouTube, has experience with DMCAs and is currently going through something similar at this time. The way that it works is Valve receives the DMCA from Nexon. Nexon says, this game is infringing my copyright, here's some evidence. Valve lawyers look at it and they go, yeah, it seems like a valid DMCA. Our hands are tied. We adhere to this. We remove it from the platform. We inform the company, which is Ironmace, that the game is being taken down for this reason. The game is then removed from Steam. A timer then starts. It's 7 to 10 days usually. It depends on which platform, in which Ironmace can file a counterclaim, a counter notice, and they can say, no, actually, we believe this is a mistake. Our thing isn't infringing copyright whatsoever. And then Valve says, okay, Nexon, the person who originally filed the DMCA, they've said it's a mistake. Is it a mistake? And then if Nexon says, no, it's not, they have to file a lawsuit formally within those 7 to 10 days. Otherwise, Valve say, okay, this DMCA is void. We reinstate the thing back on Steam. Then at that point, it might get taken down again and it might not. But essentially, it relies on the counterclaim coming in from Ironmace and then Nexon filing a formal lawsuit. So then what happens? Well, it goes to court, obviously, and this can take years, literally multiple years, especially because courts are sometimes backed up, and especially because the amount of money that's going to be thrown at this is it's going to take a real long time. And then we can obviously go over what is potentially going to happen. Personally, I think this goes to a settlement. I don't think this goes all the way, and I think Nexon will probably be in a better position for that, specifically on the trade secrets angle and not on the copyright angle, although that is a potential as well. But we'll have to wait and see. So for the lawyers from Dark and Darker to be asking Valve to bring back the game, it's just weird because everybody knows, the lawyers will obviously know, I don't know specifically why they're doing this exact play, that Valve are not going to turn around and go, yeah, we're going to go to bat for Ironmace. It would just make no sense. It's not in their best interest to do so. Why would they ever do that? Today, lawyers representing Dark and Darker developer Ironmace sent a letter to Valve disputing the DMCA notice that led to the game's removal from Steam. There's an official way you do this. Again, it's the counter notice, but the lawsuit's already been filed in Washington, so that would be useless at this point. Quote, the takedown notice is based on claims that are entirely without merit and contains knowing and material misrepresentations that Dark and Darker infringed Nexon's copyright interests, as Greenberg-Glusker lawyer Aaron Moss writes on behalf of Ironmace. Moss argues that Nexon's claims are nothing more than anti-competitive bully tactics designed to put a small indie game studio out of business. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, personally. In February, then it just goes over the history of Nexon filing the claim and things like that. In Moss's letter, which was distributed to media outlets today, he argues that since, quote, Nexon's claims relate to a game that Nexon never made and which does not exist, the publisher's claims of copyright infringement are not appropriate. Quote, Nexon claims to have created unique concepts, genre, plot, storyline, characters, and plans for the game, almost none of which is subject to copyright protection. While the actual expression of plot, storyline, and characters certainly may be protectable, copyright doesn't protect concepts. I mean, this is, again, just a weird angle to look at it. I don't know if legally it is. Obviously, he's a lawyer and he specializes in this, so I assume he'd know. But obviously, a lot of specifically civil law is just a semantics game, arguing semantics. I personally, from a common sense perspective, which again is irrelevant to legal perspective, would say Nexon were making a game and the game does exist, it's just not finished. Which you could even argue that Dark and Darker, therefore, isn't finished, because they just do beta weekends. So at the same time, you'd have to apply like logical reasoning. If Nexon's game doesn't exist because that was testing and not a finished game, then why does Dark and Darker exist? Obviously, Dark and Darker does exist more than P3 because it's way more developed now. It's actually being worked on now, whereas P3 had to get shelved. Again, I do have to explain because for some reason people still keep commenting this on my videos about Dark and Darker. P3 was not cancelled by Nexon and wasn't being made, and that's why the developers went and made it. They were still making the game. They just had to put it on hold while they fired the literal director, and then another person left, and then after that, a month later, another 10 people left. So they were making the game at the time that all of this happened. It's not like Nexon decided they weren't making it, and then the devs were like, yeah, but it's going to be a real good game, let's leave and go make it anyways. That isn't what happened. At least not from Nexon's perspective, which again, if they lied in that legal document, that is perjury. So I don't think that's the case. It could be. It definitely could be. The door's open for that to be a possibility. But I just think that interacting with it based on, I don't think they're going to perjure themselves. I don't think they lied about that specific point. It would make no sense. It would be proven wrong very, very quickly and harm their overall case. So in its takedown notice, Nexon pointed similarities between concept art for P3 and characters in Dark and Darker, though Moss argues that the similarities do not go beyond long-standing tropes of fantasy characters like wizards and barbarians. I think that they're not wrong. I don't think Ironmace's lawyers are wrong on this one. I said it in the video covering the lawsuit. The images of the characters are the weakest point in the entire thing. It's just obviously the entire thing is a total representation of their argument and not like pick apart each individual thing. If you pick apart each individual thing and look at it like, oh, this on its own, this on its own, this on its own, it looks like complete bullshit. But when you put it all together, that's when it looks like they have more of a point, at least from a layman's perspective, without a legal background. Further, Moss says that, quote, what appears in Dark and Darker consists primarily of third-party assets legally acquired from the Unreal Engine asset store. This is the argument that people have been making the whole time, and again, I believe personally that this is misrepresenting what Nexon's actual argument is here. To the extent that Nexon used the same or similar assets, that does not give rise to a copyright claim. I'd argue that that's probably more the trade secrets angle, but at the same time, this was listed in their DMCA, which is the copyright angle. I know this is complicated, and it is very complicated, and it's more complicated than I'm making it seem because I don't even fully understand it. But basically, if you're making two claims in a legal sense, copyright and the trade secrets, they're both standalone things basically that are going to be argued within the court, but the DMCA is specifically only related to copyright claims. So when this goes to court, if they very, very quickly remove the copyright angle of it, that means the DMCA will be null and void and they can release the game on Steam. Will they release the game on Steam at that point? It depends. Do they think that they're going to win? If they do, they'll probably do it so they can generate revenue. If they think that they're going to lose or be forced to settle, they will not release the game on Steam, because then any money that they raise from doing so will probably be money they're going to have to pay as restitution for the damages to Nexon if they were to lose that lawsuit, or have to settle, and they would have financials there, which would be subpoenaed from Steam, I assume. So it's very complicated, but if they get the copyright claims dismissed, then they could essentially release on Steam. That is something that is a possibility, although that would still be months down the line, potentially even years. So a fantasy game is likely to contain plenty of familiar elements ranging from skeletons to spiders. Moss argues and says that, quote, a game of the magnitude of Dark and Darker uses thousands of third-party assets in the game. Even if Nexon can cherry-pick a dozen identical assets between them, that is only a drop in the bucket in terms of actual game design. Now, one thing I am going to say is actions do speak louder than words, of course. And if you read the lawsuit from Nexon, they pointed out some very specific things that were the same between Dark and Darker and P3, and they gave visual examples in screenshots. Two of the big examples were the fact that you started in a tavern and the lighting being a yellowish glow, which apparently Nexon developed. I think that's like, nobody can know. Yellow glow of torchlight is obviously fucking, that's just what the colour fire makes. So I think that, unless there's some legal like fuckery going on there, I think that's mostly bullshit. But if you played or looked at images or videos of the new Dark and Darker playtest that came out after the lawsuit dropped, they changed some game mechanics, such as how tortures work. They changed the color of some tortures, and you don't start in a tavern, you started in a forest. So for me, when I look at like the claims, I look at them saying none of these claims are valid, then I look at them changing the game to move away from those claims. It seems to me like the actions are saying that, oh yeah, maybe these do have a little bit of validity, so let's change them, and then we can obviously prove that we've moved away from some of the claims that are being made. So I guess there's an interesting angle to look at it from that perspective. And I think the argument is, again, that they could only make Dark and Darker the way that it's made because of working at Nexon and having like access to all of the asset packs that they used, and then buying the identical ones and putting them together in an identical way to then make what is almost essentially an identical one-to-one game. I think that this is, obviously, as their lawyer, you're going to say, you know, oh, it's not actually like that, and argue against those points and say anybody could make a game like Dark and Darker and have thousands of assets be the same. But I think realistically, if you were looking at two games, like I said, if you put 100 game development studios in a room, showed them a 10-second clip of a game and said, remake this game, how many of those games do you think are going to have the identical game mechanics using the identical asset packs all throughout? And I don't think you could argue that many of them would, if any at all, would have both of those things be that close. But of course, that is going to require Nexon to be able to prove that they are that close in court. We only have their word. Again, do I think they're perjuring themselves? I don't. But at the same time, it is still on them to prove they are the one making the allegations. With examples like that, the bulk of the letter continues the argument that the similarities between P3 and Darker don't go any further than the similarities between any two fantasy games. Quote, the reality is that for every comparison Nexon can come up with, one can find half a dozen different games with the exact same feature, and in some cases the very same asset. Yeah, this is true. Again, what they're saying isn't wrong. The lawyer's not going to come out because this is how the law works. They argue around points. You could absolutely find half a dozen games with the exact same feature. You could find half a dozen games with the exact same feature with the exact same asset, but could you find half a dozen different games that have the exact same feature multiple times with the exact same assets multiple times, all jammed into one, while the developers also worked at the company previously? Now, does that matter legally? I have to keep saying that. I don't know. I would think it does, but it might matter for the trade secrets angle and not the copyright angle, which again is why they're probably petitioning Valve on the copyright angle, because Valve has nothing to do with the trade secrets portion of this lawsuit, and it's not the trade secrets that are keeping the game off of the Steam platform. Now, again, the letter is addressed to Valve, asking the company to restore Dark and Darker on Steam in defiance of Nexon's claims of copyright infringement. It's never going to happen. Literally never, ever. I would be the most surprised if this happened, if Valve turned around and went, yeah, good idea, actually. Fuck Nexon's, this multi-billion-dollar company, one of the biggest gaming companies in the world. Fuck their lawsuit and this DMCA. We'll just put the game back on Steam. I don't see any world in which that happens before something happens with the lawsuit. It was filed for copyright infringement and misappropriation of trade secrets in state Washington, but Moss argues that the latter claim only concerns one Ironmace employee and should be settled in South Korean court, where Nexon has been pursuing the claim for almost 2 years. I don't know whether this is true. I think for me, again, it makes sense that you would fight where the infringing content is being hosted. So this happens anywhere. If somebody wants to take a business to court, they only have to prove that a substantial portion of their audience exists in a country to take them to court in that country, because essentially you're operating your business within that territory, so therefore you would have jurisdiction in that territory to sue them. So when you're using Valve, a US-based company in Washington, AWS, a US-based company in the overall US, and you're trying to distribute a product there, then obviously that matters. And in terms of it only concerning one Ironmace employee, if that one Ironmace employee is like a higher up in the company and made the game using those trade secrets, I think it does impact the company personally. Again, legally, not sure. At best, Nexon has taken a handful of unprotectable elements and cobbled them together to form the illusion of a copyright infringement claim, Moss concludes, but in reality, this case comes down to the fact that Nexon does not want any of its former employees to work in an indie game studio developing a fantasy-themed extraction game. Okay, and Nexon will bend copyright law well past its breaking point in order to keep Dark and Darker out of the public's hands. Whether Valve takes these arguments and returns Dark and Darker to Steam remains to be seen, but you can bet there's a lot more legal drama to come before the game makes it to market. I don't think it remains to be seen personally. I can't imagine any fucking world in which Valve does this. It just wouldn't make any sense. I can't explain a reason why they legally would. Why would you ever risk this? It's not like Valve are hurting for the money. They don't need to get the game on there to generate some fucking that 30% kickback or whatever. It just makes no sense to me. And this obviously is just funny that Nexon don't want any of its former employees to work at an indie game studio developing a fantasy-themed extraction game. I don't think that's their argument, but yeah. So this was obviously posted on Reddit, and I came in here and like the true narcissist I am, did a search for myself. And it makes me laugh. This dude says, Kira's argument is based on a Reddit post that puts all of its weight on trade secrets, but ideas cannot be trade secrets unless Ironmace has something physical that could be considered a trade secret. Then it's impossible to prove they've stolen trade secrets. But as you can see, this dude, he's very like in on this idea that they've done absolutely nothing wrong. And he says, that's assuming they developed it. There's no proof of that. There's just an idea in preparation for development, like the assets. That's all that's been confirmed. No, it isn't. They showed like a few seconds of the gameplay in a public showcase. So that's just simply not true. You're just not interacting with the facts, my man. And the idea that I got my general argument based on a Reddit post is crazy, because most of my general argument has come from speaking to lawyers, speaking to Korean people, going through blind posts, reading the actual filings, reading what Ironmace has said and their points, reading the actual lawsuit. So I have no fucking clue what you're talking about personally. It seems like a good one of those, like, just I'll detract from this person's argument because I don't have one myself. And then again, he just makes the argument that Nexon's suite is that they used assets and ideas that Nexon they themselves have no copyright to. They never showed no evidence of actual code theft outside of Nexon, stating that they do not believe they could have programmed the game that fast if they didn't. I mean, they have factual evidence that he did have access to the code, and they have factual evidence that he did say he was going to hand over his server, and then factual evidence that he then deleted the server and told them he wouldn't give them access to it to determine whether he'd misappropriated the trade secrets and copyright or not. I don't understand how you have an opinion on this without reading any of the relevant reading material. I don't get it personally. Why would you say I only got my opinions from a Reddit post when you didn't get your opinions from engaging with anything that fucking actually happened? Kira doesn't know the full story. People act like his videos is the end all be all. I don't think anyone's acting like that, mate. I'm not even acting like that, but my videos don't get, one, enough viewership for that to be the case, and two, the entire Dark and Darker subreddit and Discord will literally fucking throw stones at you until you die if you even talk about me, and they all hate me. So I'd love to see this fucking overwhelming support for me and my opinions and what I've done. Kira is also just not very smart. He's like lazy peon IQ tier. I do just want to highlight as well that the guy who's saying I don't know the full story posts in the conspiracy subreddit. But there we go, that's the Dark and Darker letter. I would have liked to have seen the full letter myself. I don't think they linked to it in here, at least I didn't see it. I will try and search for it and then give it a read, and if there's anything interesting in it that it wasn't already highlighted in this article on Gamesradar, which I'll link in the video description, then I'll make another video. But at this point, it's interesting that they're going this angle. I don't know what for. I don't know if this is just like more, you know, public interest play, which people seem to think that when I mention that, I'm being like overtly negative towards Ironmace's position and saying that they shouldn't be doing this. In a lawsuit, when somebody's got more money than you, more power than you, and even potentially more of a point than you, why the fuck would you not be leveraging the public interest when the public's on your side already and people hate Nexon? Why would you not be doing that? Especially if you're, one, going to crowdfund, and two, the public interest and backlash can actually help you win the case. I've never said that this is a bad idea or a unsound legal strategy. I think it's actually completely valid, and they're probably doing the right thing in their position. I do think some of the stuff like releasing the game on a torrent and stuff like that might come back to bite them in the arse at some point, but that depends entirely on how the lawsuit goes, if it gets to that point, and other things that we just can't know yet. So yeah, this does just seem like another play for public support, because I assume everybody knows Valve are not going to turn around and be like, yeah, fuck it, fuck that lawsuit, fuck that DMCA, let's get the game back on our platform. It's just, why would they ever risk it? They don't need the gold doubloons and they don't need the drama. Valve is a very anti-drama platform. They want to not be involved as much as possible. So there we go. Thanks for watching. I'll keep you updated on all the Dark and Darker stuff as always, and I'll see you next time. Peace out.